So let us look at this scenario. We have a 65-year-old patient with chronic kidney disease, and this patient is diagnosed with anemia. Okay, so do you think it is the chronic kidney disease that is contributing to anemia, and if so, how? The blood cells and the blood tests have been carried out, and they are revealing that there is reduced red blood cell count and also hemoglobin levels, and the doctor has decided to give this patient erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is actually a hormone that is naturally secreted by the kidneys, to be specific. And in this case, we are talking about synthetic erythropoietin that has been given to this patient. So what will this hormone actually do in helping the situation? Okay, so the first questions that we are actually having, one is that how is the chronic kidney disease related to anemia? How is it leading to anemia? That's one. Two, how will this synthetic erythropoietin help in managing this patient's condition? And then thirdly, we are looking at the patient's red blood cells having a shorter lifespan, and this has implications on the patient's health. And what could you predict in terms of what would actually happen if these red blood cells are getting destroyed before their normal lifespan actually reaches? And then the last part is that while the doctor is actually giving this synthetic erythropoietin, they are monitoring the patient's red blood cell count. Can you explain why when the red blood cell count increases so high, it becomes a problem? The other question that you can actually look at is a question to do with a researcher who is studying a rare genetic condition. And this genetic condition is one which is characterized by the red blood cells having nuclei. Okay, and again, they also possess some organelles. So this is an abnormal situation. Ideally, the red blood cells should not have a nucleus and they should not have organelles. Okay, so the point here is why is it a problem? When the red blood cells have a nucleus, why is it a problem? Okay, and then of course, can you relate the fact that the red blood cells that have nuclei and the red blood cells without the nuclei and the organelles, can you relate these to these structural differences in terms of how these red blood cells will actually flow in the capillary? And then the second last question about this scenario is an issue to do with what are the possible consequences for having these structural characteristics of having nuclei and also having organelles. And then the last is, why is this condition not seen in most mammals? Do you think this has an evolutionary advantage, and what evolutionary advantage are we talking about here? Okay, so those are the questions in the second question that we can use also to understand the things that we are going to study. First, the red blood cells can actually be called erythrocytes. We can also usually say RBCs, but basically these are red cells. So we can use three names: red cells, or red blood cells, or erythrocytes. They are the most abundant cells in the body, meaning that they're actually very, 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 very many in the human body. They are in millions and millions. Okay, what's their role? Red blood cells transport oxygen. Okay, they transport oxygen, but also carbon dioxide. They lack a nucleus and they have a biconcave shape. Okay, we shall see how these two characteristics are related to their function. They are very, very, very tiny and of course numerous. So the fact that they are very tiny, it means that they can squeeze themselves through the capillaries. Remember, we are saying that the diameter of these red blood cells is similar to the diameter of the capillaries through which they have to pass. So that means that these red blood cells have the ability to squeeze themselves through capillaries. Okay, so we said there are quite many, and if you get a microliter of blood, you will get millions. Okay, millions of what? Of red blood cells. So for males, they actually have more red blood cells compared to females. And that is why in males, you are likely to get between 4.5 to 6 million red blood cells per microliters. And then also in women, you can find 3.5 to 5 million red blood cells per microliter. Okay, so we talked about two adaptations earlier on. One was related to the fact that the red blood cells are actually numerous, and that means that they can be able to carry sufficient oxygen. Two is that they are actually bioconcave, this which increases the surface area for attachment of these gases. Okay, of course the gases attach to hemoglobin, and red blood cells actually have this hemoglobin for carrying these gases. And then the other thing is that they are actually very thin. That means that when these gases are to be released, they can easily be released because they can only diffuse out. Okay, and then lastly, we are saying that they lack nuclei. Red blood cells lack nuclei, and that therefore means that they have space for carrying oxygen, but also they lack numerous organelles, so we don't have structures within the red blood cell. And that's why when what you have is on the screen, you have just a circle, one which is basically cut through and one which is you can see from the upper end. So they don't have any structures in there. Okay, so no organelles. That means more space for carrying oxygen. And I think this actually answers one of the questions related to the genetic disorder. Okay, so these red blood cells are very important. If you don't have sufficient red blood cells, you become anemic. Okay, so we have that number. That number can be used as a reference point. If you have less than the normal ranges that we have put there, we say you are anemic. Okay, so that means that the process of making red blood cells is very important, such that you don't have less red blood cells. That process is termed as homopoiesis, okay, and happens in the bone marrow. Okay, so we have different bones that actually make these red blood cells. Okay, remember we're saying that the bone marrow is what is where we get these red blood cells. Okay, and we have specific bones in adults that produce these red blood cells, but for infants, all bones actually can make red blood cells. Okay, so we have the sternum, pelvis, ribs, vertebrae, and then we have clavicles, scapulae, and the skull. These are bones that can actually make red blood cells. Okay, so a hormone called erythropoietin, which is made by the kidney, stimulates the production of these red blood cells. Okay, so that means that if the kidneys are not working, then definitely this hormone cannot be produced in sufficient amounts such that it can cause for production of more red blood cells. And that is why the patient who has chronic kidney disease is having anemia. The red blood cells are actually few because this hormone is not being produced in sufficient amounts, and this is a problem. Okay, So this hormone is secreted every time we have low oxygen levels. So if you are exposed to conditions of low oxygen, which we term as hypoxia, your body will secrete, basically the kidneys will secrete erythropoietin. Okay, so we have talked about the numbers of these red blood cells, and we emphasize that they actually vary by sex. We have seen that males have more red blood cells than females, and then by age, and then by health status. If you get a disease that affects your red blood cells, you'll have low blood cells, low red blood cells, and that also relates to, for example, if you're eating well, if you are exercising, and also depending on where you are, where do you stay? Do you stay in high altitude areas or in low altitude areas, and things like that? Do you exercise? Do you have any supplements that you're taking? What is your diet? Okay, so the red blood cells carry gases because there is a protein called hemoglobin, and it is this protein that combines with these gases. And this combination is usually reversible because you have places where, or tissues where you need to release oxygen, and then you have places where you need to pick oxygen. So that means that the combination of hemoglobin with oxygen has to be reversible. What is formed is oxyhemoglobin. Okay, when you have oxygen combining with hemoglobin, you have oxyhemoglobin being formed. Okay, so where is this oxygen released? When it combines with hemoglobin in the respiring tissues. The respiring tissues will need this oxygen, and this oxygen has to leave the hemoglobin and go into the tissues to be used for respiration. Okay, and then you also have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and this plays an important role in the transportation of carbon dioxide. Remember, we are saying that red blood cells transport two things, mainly oxygen, but also carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has other means through which it is actually transported in the body apart from combining with hemoglobin. So we said that if the red blood cells have a shorter lifespan, what is that lifespan? The lifespan is about 3 months or 120 days. So if the red blood cells are having less than that, it means that they are having a shorter lifespan, and that is problematic because you will not have sufficient capacity to carry oxygen, okay, and deliver it to the tissues that actually need it. So that's a problem there. So the 120 days, what do they imply? That every time you have red blood cells being made, every second you have very many red blood cells being made, and these red blood cells will stay in your blood for about 120 days, and then they have to be broken down such that more red blood cells actually are reusing what comes out of the breakdown of the old red blood cells. So the old red blood cells usually they get, if I can say, tired. So they become less flexible, they become fragile, they can easily be broken and things like that. So they can also rupture. Okay, so they don't live forever. Okay, what destroys these old red blood cells? It is the liver and the spleen that do this role. Usually, the spleen actually filter and remove the old red blood cells. And usually, if you have your spleen damaged, you will have a problem because it is a store of a lot of blood, because you have it filtering out red blood cells that are actually very old, and then squeezing them through the sinuses in the spleen, and then the ones that are very fragile actually rupture and are digested by the macrophages. Usually, you will get the following components if you break down red blood cells. You will get protein, and then you get iron, you get heme. Okay, so the protein, basically the amino acids, the iron is part of the hemoglobin. It's very important in transport of oxygen. And then the heme, this usually is turned into pigments, bilirubin and biliverdin, and these are excreted through bile, and this is what actually gives the feces their color. Okay, so some of the iron will actually be reused. Some of the iron will actually be reused. Okay, so we are saying that a lot of processes are happening every second. You have millions of red blood cells being destroyed and also millions being made. Okay, so that is about the turnover. If you have more destruction than what replaces, then you have a problem. So you need to have more being made compared to those that are being broken down. Okay, so the production is influenced by the level of oxygen. We already said that erythropoietin is released when you have low oxygen concentration or low oxygen conditions, and this stimulates the erythropoietin to be stimulate the kidneys to release erythropoietin, and then you have more red blood cells being formed. And if you have more oxygen, then you don't need to have a lot of red blood cells, so the production will reduce definitely. And this is basically what happens. This situation of balancing whether to increase or reduce is what happens in high altitude areas. If there is in high altitude areas, you have limited supply of oxygen in the atmosphere, so that definitely means that the kidneys will have to produce erythropoietin, and then you have more production of red blood cells. And this happens as your body is getting used, the term that we call acclimatization. Or here we are saying that this production of red blood cells is very important in getting acclimatized to high altitude areas.